About a week ago, I released a video discussing Yama and the length of the grind associated after Jagex nerfed his drop rates by around 30%, effectively taking a 60-hour grind and making it an 80-hour grind. While this was a hot topic at the moment, something that I always wanted to address was the more substantial issue to me, because quite frankly, this change in drop rates isn't a big deal. The topic I really want to talk about is gatekeeping aspirational content and the way that works in Oldschool Runescape as opposed to other MMOs. I'll try to keep things as short as I can because I'm unsure if there is too much nuance to find here. If you aren't aware, Yama is Jagex's second attempt at releasing a boss with a hard mode variant that can only be done a limited number of times. The first time was with Desert Treasure 2, and it was with 4 bosses. I'm not here to litigate the quality of these fights, but rather the systems in place to facilitate them. Although judging by the first day of Yama's contract system, it feels more than a little bit rushed and underdeveloped. I can't help but feel like this entire situation should have been iterated on through player-driven feedback prior to launching it in a state that doesn't really appeal to what seems like most people. Anyway, let's take a peek into the past. The Awakener's Orbs are a semi-rare drop from any one of the 4 Desert Treasure 2 bosses. If held in your inventory, they allow you to access a more difficult version of the fight, which has a very slightly increased unique drop rate and deals more damage, has more health, and even has a couple new mechanics as well. The orb is destroyed upon entering, meaning that even if you kill the boss, you can't do it again unless you obtain another orb. The reason to do this, outside of just challenging yourself, is for the Sanguine Torva armor set, achieved by killing all 4 of the Desert Treasure 2 bosses in their awakened hard mode variants. Sanguine Torva is a cosmetic kit attached to your pre-existing Torva armor that is obtained elsewhere and is a signifier of your skill, but it isn't just a signifier of your skill. While the awakened versions of these 4 bosses are undeniably difficult, some of the hardest content in the entire game, they are also expensive. An average high-skill player will be spending hundreds of millions of gold just for their attempts at these fights. On average, the first and only clear of any individual boss can take anywhere between 50 to 150 attempts. So if we average that out to 100 per boss, that, depending on the current price of the orbs, is around 82 million gold per fight and around 330 million for all 4. In other words, that's around a full set of Oathplate armor or 224,489 adamant scimitars. And that isn't even including the billions of gold for best in slot gear, millions for resources, and of course, God knows how much for the death costs. And I think this system kind of sucks. Inspired by Path of Exile, the Awakener's Orbs and eventually the contracts are a way to integrate an insular resource economy into one or multiple bosses. It gives the developers a way to create an ecosystem that can be participated in by both high-skill and low-skill players, as well as buoying the economy without damaging standard skill-related resources. Let's address the latter point first, the economy. One of the more challenging knobs to tune when designing a boss encounter is determining what it drops and in what quantity. At one point, bosses would drop a plethora of resources and eventually began to devalue them. You can see some of the seeds collapsing in price after TOA and hear about the pain of the Zulrah drop table. The course correction here was to drastically pull back from providing satisfying or exciting commons. That's how we got bosses like Nightmare and Fasani's Nightmare respectively, wherein braving the hardest solo encounter rewarded you with an inventory full of food for level 50 players or 40 magic logs. If I had to guess, the excitement would stem from rolling the single actually worthwhile common, such as the Snapdragon Seeds from Nightmare or the Onyx Bolts from a DT2 boss. And I do understand this. I may be an Ironman, but the player-driven economy is a huge selling point of RuneScape. It's one of the many reasons it's so unique and gives players a fascinating alternative to playing. It should be a consideration, and making sure not every boss is stacked to the teeth with powerful commons makes sense. The balance is the problem, and it's also a subjective problem. Some people are more happy with bosses like Nightmare, and people like me are less so. Not just because it's unexciting or deflating, but because in my humble opinion, doing a boss well should recoup the resource cost, not by providing identical resources, but by instead providing some kind of alternative. That is how you incentivize a flow state driven loop for bossing, rather than shining a light on going dry. After all, if you consume enough resources, you may run out without getting what you truly desire, the unique. It makes the entire endeavor, regardless of your skill, feel fruitless. As we all know, burnout stems from a feeling of stagnancy. If you don't think you're making progress, then you are more prone to burning out. Burnout is the gridlock of video game grinds, and making sure there's some movement in traffic can alleviate that heavily. But the truth is, it's all subjective. The end result should always be a fight that is done a healthy amount by the demographic it is intended for. That is, the end-all be-all for what is and isn't a good fight in Oldschool Runescape. A fight like Nightmare isn't done, and therefore we can discuss why. A fight like Zulrah is, so now we ought see if anything is out of balance without ruining that player engagement. But how does this all relate to Awakener's Orbs? Well, they're part of the solution. As I said, a semi-rare drop that is always going to be worth a pretty penny because there will always be a group of endgame players pushing and spending for their Blood Torva. On its surface, this is a compelling answer and can even spice up the rather boring common drop table. While orbs aren't technically a common as they drop off a separate secondary unique table, for the benefit of this conversation we could include them because they are more common than some commons. Unfortunately, they create a whole host of other issues that could be interpreted as even worse than devaluing certain items in the economy. To parse what and why, we first need to agree on what aspirational content is and what it is used for. Aspirational content is a catch-all term for endgame achievements that are completed by player skill and patience, usually more so the former than the latter. While patience is a skill in RuneScape, aspirational content generally takes the form of something more reliant on in-game talent, being great at utilizing the combat system, for example. What does aspirational content in RuneScape even look like? The most well-known is of course the Inferno, a multi-hour gauntlet of increasing challenges that culminates with a final boss. It's long, arduous, difficult, frustrating, and rewards a small upgrade to your back slot. This was inspired by the original aspirational content in RuneScape, the Fight Caves. More recently, we had an evolution of this format with the Colosseum, similarly a wave-based challenge that rewarded a best-in-slot back piece, this time for ranged. But the Colosseum brought with it some rather interesting changes. It's shorter, more rewarding, and arguably a bit more intuitive. It's content that's meant to be grinded just as much as it's content that is meant to be done only once, for the guaranteed reward at the end. It has its own common drop table and its own, not guaranteed, uniques alongside the guaranteed back piece. I think Jagex realized that a 2-hour gauntlet that is only done once by most players is a difficult sell to design. Instead, create something that fits both longevity and aspiration, and I think they succeeded in doing so. But also, aspiration is inherently tied to longevity. The only thing that would ever devalue the rewards obtained from aspirational content is being able to overpower said content. Because the power scale of Osrs is incredibly slow, the power creep of the game has yet to fully devalue the Inferno almost a decade after its release. And I don't just mean that the cape is still the best in slot. I mean that the content remains challenging, and therefore, the cape is a signifier of your skill if you get it. Aspirational content can also be hard mode TOB or really high invocations TOA, two raids that mixed approachability with aspiration depending on how you choose to engage them. And of course, aspirational content is Awakened Desert Treasure 2, it's Awakener's Orbs, it's Blood Torva. It's also worth noting the rewards for aspirational content are often cosmetic, but in RuneScape, they aren't always. Inferno, Colosseum, Hard Mode TOB, TOA, these all reward tangible progression. Awakened DT2 bosses don't. They reward a cosmetic kit to a pre-existing armor set. That alone could be enough to dismiss any criticism toward them from certain players, because why do you care if some random cosmetic is more readily available? Isn't that devaluing it? Why do you want Easyscape? I don't, not necessarily. What I do want is to find a nuance by addressing player psychology, particularly in the way developers can create content that incentivizes engagement. After all, aspiration is reliant on incentive. That's the other half of designing this branch of content. That's part of what I love about OSRS, It's not marred by cosmetic glut and readily available MTX. For example, in World of Warcraft, you really can't tell what someone is wearing without navigating some UI to inspect them. That's because most people are just overwriting their real set with a bunch of cosmetics, and when one of the more tangible rewards from achieving something is a cosmetic, it kind of gets lost in the mud. It's also the issue with Guild Wars 2, wherein legendary sets are aesthetically devalued because they're often paired with even better looking armor sets on the cash shop. It's not like you can buy that specific set, but what you can do is buy something that looks as good, if not better. It's like an implicit devaluation because item value is determined by scarcity and clout. If something is rare and cool looking, it's seen as a commodity. If there were a dozen capes that looked identical to the Inferno cape but with a slightly different tint of orange, a new player, a tastemaker, is far less likely to consider it as something special, and therefore the clout and purpose of achieving that is marginally devalued. That aspiration is not created because they cannot tell what isn't worth aspiring to. As much as it's common to suggest that any and all motivation you have to gain something is personal, that really isn't true. Individuality is great and all, but we live in a society, both in-game and out. What you are seen as is as important as what you identify as. That's why our identities are tied to the way we are perceived. If there is a mismatch of identity and perception, then it's something you seek to align through performance. You act in the way that is more in line with what you identify as individually. Someone is far less likely to pursue a 200-hour grind if the reward is a bronze dagger. Even though this achievement of patience is admirable, its lack of presence in the way it is identified makes it highly unincentivized. And that opposes aspirational content by definition. Aspirational content exists to incentivize new and returning players to play the game more and eventually do that content. Every point of friction between them and their newly determined goal is a fine balance between effort and progression. It wouldn't be aspirational if you could achieve it overnight and without much skill, but it also wouldn't ever be aspired to if it took 10 years and rewarded nothing. I mean, it probably would be aspired to by someone in this community, but not only would that be a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the player base, they'd likely make a YouTube series out of it and eventually make a career out of it, which in turn becomes a different kind of aspiration. And the value of those items that you earn are actually identified positively by your audience. Where Awakener's orbs fail is in the amount of friction demanded. This is, once again, subjective because in an open player economy, earning gold would be aspirational in a sense. So my argument is a bit more niche. What I'm saying is that this additional layer on top of the pre-existing layers of gold-restricted content is too much friction. It makes players feel stationary, too afraid to pursue something. In other words, it turns away more people than it attracts. If the end result of, say, removing Awakener's orbs entirely, which just so we're clear I'm not necessarily advocating for, is that more players get Sanguine Torva, that's not really a bad thing. That's actually way more demonstrable of a player's skill because all that was required to achieve it is skill. So what people are afraid of is devaluing their gold investment more so than their skill expression. And that is both something I can empathize with, but also something I think doesn't really fit hard mode bossing. These orbs are inspired by Path of Exile, but I don't think they achieve the same means to an end because the game operates differently. OSRS has a more complex economy, more content, and ultimately more longevity in its content. That's why applying this system without first engaging in the already existing systems and tuning knobs is overcomplicating and under-designing a solution. Please note how I have not yet complained about being an Ironman. Okay, now I'm going to complain about being an Ironman, so plug your ears, Mainscapers. This system is of course an enormous failure of design for 30% of its player base that wants to engage in this content. I want to eventually make a video on Ironman game modes, but for brevity's sake, all I'll say is that there is a persistent meme that spreads through the community when discussing Ironman, one that involves people dismissing their criticism because they chose to limit themselves and chose the painful grind, when that really isn't why people play Ironman, and certainly does not mean every grind in the game is not problematic. People aren't choosing to play Ironman because they're masochists. They're doing so because playing Ironman filters them through a wider diversity of content with a purpose. Instead of wanting to collection log bosses just because, or be psychologically pushed into only grinding the most profitable content, they want to operate more naturally within the ecosystem present in the game. As a result, they are more connected to the good and bad of those systems alone. That's because they actually do them. Think of it this way, there's a reason why most collection loggers have full bisc gear. They are doing what is left to be done. They have enough gold to sustain grinds even at a loss. Meanwhile, players who are still on the item progression path are pressured, incentivized to pursue the best gold per hour. The collections can wait, there's Torva to buy. I'm not saying that every player is like this, I'm sure there are other people doing collection logs normally, but go to any Nightmare world and look who's currently massing Nightmare. It's just a bunch of people in Sanguine or just regular Torva with scythes just kind of AFKing it. And while the common counter-argument to my pro-Ironman stance is just saying that the economy is a system that the game is designed around, my counter to that counter would be to say that the economy isn't a cure-all for bad design. Jagex is not creating new content with the idea that most players should skip it with the Grand Exchange. While I haven't talked with a developer on the game to confirm this, I am confident in that deduction. The economy is seen as a secondary ecosystem that offers countless unique options for players that engage with it. You can use it to skip bosses, you can use it to skip certain grinds, and that's fine, but that's not content, that's a piece of UI. The content is what you did to eventually interface with a Grand Exchange. We should support creating something that is beneficial, fun, and unique, then give the option to skip it. If we fail to achieve the former, then everyone is going to default to the latter. It, much like anything else in the game, is a balance, and it's one Jagex can and has missed the mark on. It's a complex game, and creating content for it is challenging. It's fine to miss, but we can't sacrifice fixing or adding quality to alleviate friction points that are deemed as too much by the people actually doing the content. Not skipping it, doing it. It's flat out bad designed and unhealthy for the game. Refusing to update something because of the economic precedent is not a sacrifice that's beneficial in the long term. It saves you a couple mil here and there, but ultimately what you're left with is a game with less expansive and interesting content. So let's look at how 30% of the community engages with Awakener's orbs. They don't. Ironmen don't do awakened bosses, not in the way that the system was designed. Oftentimes, Ironmen simply don't have enough orbs even after completing the entire Desert Treasure 2 boss grind for all of the uniques. And I don't mean enough orbs to average completing all 4 bosses, I mean enough to even complete a single one. I have over 3,000 kills on the 4 bosses cumulatively and around 50 to 60 orbs. If on average it takes 100 orbs for a kill, then that's around 6,000 boss kills for a single awakened one. No one is doing this. So what's the alternative? It's to practice on a main account, read dissertations on the fight beforehand, and cautiously attempt. I won't delve into the unintended side effect that forcing Ironmen on mains has, particularly in pushing people to buy bonds just to fund their practice runs, but it's worth considering. Of course, some Ironmen are already experienced with this content, having done it on their main, and can do it in just about like 1 or 3 attempts. But they are not the group of players we're referring to when talking about aspirational content. They have already aspired and done it before. So 30% of the populace doesn't engage with their actual character, and 70% of the populace still barely does, because on its own, PVM, while being my favorite content in Osrs, is still a hard sell. A lot of the community still hosts a fear of failure and a fear of loss. Because you aren't just failing when you die to a boss, you lose a chunk of your earnings as well. There's a death cost, a resource cost, and for certain players that may be incentivized to pursue PVM, that incentive dissipates when they first interact with that friction. An example here is one of my friends who no longer plays the game. He maxed the main and almost maxed an Ironman in just about 3 years. Not once did he step foot in any raid or do any aspirational content. Why? Too scary. didn't want to lose gold on attempts. This friction isn't even bad for the game though. A kind of exclusivity in PvM is what lends some of the value to the uniques, and having a swath of players stick to skilling is what brings in a host of supplies into the game too. As for deaths, it's an open player economy and therefore needs gold sinks and resource sinks to balance things out. It's also how skills get integrated as well. That's all fine. But the addition to all of that being a completely insular item that only exists in the vacuum of that content is unnecessary on every level. Maybe this is my Ironman brain talking, but I feel like it's not too controversial to say that I'd sacrifice a tiny impact on the economy if it meant creating difficult content that is more readily available. We don't put bear traps along the road of a marathon because we recognize that a marathon itself is difficult enough. I mean, that'd also be evil, but you get my comparison. If we want more players readily engaging in skill-related challenges, especially for only cosmetic rewards, then opening up that opportunity is borderline mandatory to me. And that's all that's really being asked for here. The reward for these awakened bosses is cosmetic, so crank up the difficulty and let people try and fail unmarred by needless friction. After all, that's how other aspirational content already works. There are no items gating you from sending a 500 TOA or a hard mode TOB or the Inferno or the Colosseum. If the loss of GP per hour is too much, then there are surely other ways to alleviate that, considering every other boss manages just fine, except Fasani. This brings us back to Yama, the newest incarnation of friction for the sake of challenge. I will state once again that I love this fight, and I'm in support of the drop rate changes. However, the contract system is an utter disaster. I am shocked to say that it may be worse than the already widely disliked Awakener orbs. Strange considering it was advertised as an improvement over them. Jagex is very well aware that orbs are disliked, so it's unfortunate that through the testing phases of this fight, they didn't notice that these contracts are, on average, more rare. More rare. Why? The answer is because there's yet another new system on top of this new system, created to alleviate the issues formed by the inclusion of the first new system. Call me crazy, but 2 bespoke systems added for a single boss just to fix the problems that only exist because of the inclusion of the first system is over-designing, to say the least. What I am referring to is the Demon Slayer Contract Slayer thing that allows less skilled players to instead kill low-level demons within the Chasm of Fire in slightly tedious ways to have a chance of obtaining some of the contracts. The solution to making this already disliked system better is to say, hey, kill 1000 level 70 demons. I don't think it's surprising that this fails on almost every level. It fails as compelling content, it fails as meaningful reward, and it fails as an incentive. The only group it successfully captures are bots and maybe some low-level players that can make a quick buck. I don't think this piece of content needed engagement from this demographic. It's an endgame fight. We just got a mid-game boss a few months back. Similarly, the option to mindlessly grind fodder for dozens of hours just to attempt a boss is kind of wild. It's hard to apply an analytical framework to this because it's on its face absurd. As much as I love glazing RuneScape and criticizing World of Warcraft on this channel, it's worth considering what other competing MMOs are doing. While WoW has its own issues with aspirational content, their accessibility is only limited by the size of the group. Otherwise, you can just do a Mythic raid whenever you want. You can hop into a high-level Mythic Plus whenever. The friction is minor because the difficulty speaks for itself. For the first time in my memory, this contract and orb system is fully reliant on the economy to achieve. This is flat out just a gold sink. While Awakener's orbs shifted some gold value to the boss, and arguably the contracts do something similar, the fact that the contracts are readily available from fodder grinds likely puts them in a less valuable position. Regardless, the result will likely just be buy them. While for some mains that may be okay because they aren't eager to empathize with the plight of the Ironman, it's undeniably a wonky system at best, right? It's not far-fetched to say that an endgame boss that relies on running to the Grand Exchange for an attempt token is unrewarding and frustrating in the same way Awakener's orbs are, but it is made even worse by contracts themselves being split into 11 different types, meaning that successfully collecting for 11 different contracts is even more absurd, and even more of a gold sink. This is made stranger by many of these contracts not even being a cosmetic reward, they're just a regular reward, a guaranteed drop, two of which are only obtainable from Yama himself and guarantee one of the uniques. Not only is guaranteeing a unique not in the spirit of the game, in my opinion, certainly outside of gauntlet-driven challenges like Colosseum and Inferno, it's also a wrench in the economy itself. Now those contracts are incredibly expensive on their own and have to be made even rarer to compensate for their reward. Most recently, Jagex once again pushed out a patch to increase the rate at which contracts are obtained. This is a band-aid. I'm a broken record when I say this, but this system is a failure of concept, but it's being addressed as a failure of balance. If contracts are made common enough, they lose all value and no longer fill a worthwhile economic gap, and if they're too rare, then they add too much friction to aspire to. Fixing one unbalances the other. Contracts and Awakener's orbs are an enormous miss in otherwise wonderful pieces of content. I hope that Jagex works on this in the future. I'm not a game designer, but if I had carte blanche to design the Yama contracts, this is what I would do. TOA invocations. You already figured it out like 3 years ago. You walk up to Yama, right-click, press the Make a Deal button, and then open up an interface that presents you with a list of contracts that you can choose from. You make that deal, and the fight begins. If you die, you lose a larger portion of your gold as a death cost, maybe 3 or 4 times more than average, as part of the bargain. And if you succeed, you get the cosmetic. That's it. It's thematically more coherent too, since Yama is very much a traditional demonic entity, one that is inspired by the likes of the devil, and therefore making deals with him is very much on brand. You even do this before beginning the fight for the very first time. To make a deal with the devil, you don't run around their home killing a bunch of smaller devils. That's thematically incoherent. I would get rid of contracts that guarantee uniques and repurpose contracts that guarantee some of the unique commons, such as Diabolic Worms becoming the only drop to facilitate some kind of target farming. The pros of this proposition are as follows. It removes the additional layer of gold gating from aspirational content that isn't already gated by death costs, bis gear, and resources. It makes newer, less experienced PVMers more excited to try this content without first needing to spend hours on the wiki and YouTube in fear of losing hundreds of millions of gold. It allows Ironman to actually participate in this content without needing an entirely different account. It's more thematically interesting, and finally, it removes an overly complicated and unnecessary solution that was only added because it alleviates the problems introduced with the baseline contract system. The cons of this are, it lowers the average gold per hour at Yama, which of course can be alleviated but would require economic sacrifices. It makes mid-game or less skilled players not able to engage with killing level 70 demons for hours, and it makes the cosmetic rewards more common without making the content any easier. You can determine what you prefer, but it should be clear what I do. I want to leave this short video off on one final note. It's not too late to make changes. As someone who's relatively new to the community, one of the most disheartening things to see is how much content is left incomplete or permanently damaged with little incentive to fix, because fixing can be seen as too challenging due to it potentially having negative effects on the economy. This is particularly bad in a game like RuneScape where content is permanent. It isn't something that gets forgotten about in half-year increments like in an average theme park MMO. Fasani's Nightmare, the Cox unique table, the existence of irrelevant nonsense like the Calphite Queen, all of these things should have been addressed a couple months after their release, barring the Calphite Queen of course. But they haven't, because shaking up a loot table or drastically reworking a fight after the values have settled is seen as not worth the attempt. Players are likely to freak out if the Inquisitor's set is worth less, even if it means Fasani's Nightmare becomes an encounter people actually do, an actual path for progression. The real impetus for change should be driven by longevity, not by reactionary sentiment. Fasani is taking a beating in this conversation, but it's inexcusable how bad this content is. Comparing it to Yama is laughable. It's a harder boss, a longer kill time, a more punishing encounter, has worse commons, worse uniques, a far longer runback, and, due to all of this, is ignored. A fix to 1 or 3 of these glaring flaws would create a new avenue for endgame without needing to design an entirely new fight. It's also alleviating irrelevant bloat from the game. That's also why I would support reworking the Calfight Queen. A solution isn't to ignore it and work on something else, because that's how you get a game where a portion of the content is just bloat. It's totally unneeded, it's not done, and it can often overcomplicate a new player's engagement by forcing them to default to external resources for guidance over what is and isn't worth doing. It's worth mentioning that new players are the lifeblood of a live service game, an MMO. Whether an MMO lives or dies is purely determined by the amount of players leaving as opposed to joining, because there are always people quitting the game, and always players starting. As long as there are more new players than departing ones, the game grows and remains successful. Perpetuating unneeded friction is what pushes people away. It isn't always healthy. A new player should see dozens of paths for progression. That's the beauty of a curated sandbox like RuneScape. Right now, that does exist, but a couple of those paths break away into a pit of snakes. As a semi-new player who over the past year and a half is brushing up on 2200 total level, I can attest to this. We already only get 1 or 2 endgame updates a year at most. It's saddening to see that a not insubstantial percentage of that content is relegated to irrelevancy thanks to economic fears that affect already irrelevant items. It's not that I hope that future bosses don't use the contract system. They probably won't. What I hope is that this system is fully changed now. Shoulder the burden of a mistake and fix it. Don't let it languish, rot, and permanently damage the edifice of the progression in this game. After all, RuneScape has the best progression of any MMO, so every miss like this is what ends up damaging it in the long run.